Hey guys, Dimension Master Studios here. How y'all doing? So, when it comes to Season 11, this is a pretty divisive season when it comes to the fan base, with people having a lot of various opinions when it comes to this season. However, one thing that's basically universally agreed upon when it comes to this season, regardless of whether people like it or not, is that the episode Snaketastrophy is one of, if not the worst episodes of the entire season and of the show in general. And with me personally being such a big fan of Season 11, this is an opinion that I completely agree with, 100%. I think this episode is pretty bad overall. I may like Season 11, and trust me, I really do, but I'm also willing to admit when this season has problems, and this episode I think is definitely one of them, and I completely agree with the idea that this is the worst episode of the season. And in today's video, I'm going to explain why. So, let's get into this whole thing. So, right off the bat, this episode shows us that it's going to be pretty different compared to what we're used to with Ninjago episodes, because this episode is done in the style of a news broadcast, with the NGTV News reporting on the Pyro Viper attack that's happening in Ninjago City. And this is one of the very, very few things that I actually liked about the episode, with that being the creative concept for the episode. I've said it before and I'll say it again, but one of the big things that I absolutely love about the 11-minute format is the creativity that we got with the episodes. As a result of the episodes being shorter, it allowed for the writers to be a lot more creatively free with the episode concepts, and we could get episodes that we could usually never get with the episodes being 22 minutes long. And this is something that we got all throughout the Wild Brain era, with there being multiple episodes that completely changed up the style of the episode as a result of the episodes being shorter, which in my opinion ended up giving us some of the most creative episodes in the entirety of Ninjago. And when it comes to Snaketastrophy, it is definitely an example of this kind of thing happening. I don't think it's a particularly good example, and I feel like there's definitely other episodes in Season 11 that do a much better job at handling this, but still, this is an example of the Wild Brain era using the 11-minute format to its advantage, with an episode being in a different style compared to what we're used to, which, again, that is something that I do like. That being said, though, I feel like this episode being in the style of a news broadcast is also a double-edged sword, because while I do like the creative freedom present in the episode, there's also a major issue that I have with this show doing this, and it's that I feel like as a result of this episode being done in the style of a news broadcast, it feels like there isn't really that much of a plot to this episode, and for the most part, it feels like things just kind of happen during the episode. There is a bit more plot when it comes to the stuff with Gail Gossip and
Vinny of NGTV News?
But for the most part, the episode doesn't really focus on these two, so again, for the most part, it feels like there isn't really that much of a plot to this episode, and it feels like things just happen, essentially, in it, which is something that, honestly, I wasn't really a big fan of. So we get to the first news report being done by Fred Finley, a news reporter who works for NGTV News, and he's trying to interview people on the Pyro Viper attack. However, because of the attack, everyone's obviously really scared and panicked, so they're all running away from the Pyro Vipers, meaning that Fred can't get anyone to properly interview. We then cut to Gail Gossip and Vinny, who are reporting on a puppy petting competition. However, some Pyro Vipers end up attacking the pet store, and Gail and Vinny decide to follow them in order to figure out what's going on. We then cut to a series of in-universe commercials advertising various things, including a car dealership, some sunscreen, and Laffy's karaoke bar, and the third commercial is by default the best one because Dareth is in it. And this is what I mean when I say it feels like things just happen during this episode, because we're already about 1/3 of the way through the episode, and there's really only been one significant thing that's actually happened so far, and that's Gail and Vinny following the Pyro Vipers. That's been about it. Everything else is basically just unfunny joke after unfunny joke, and the entire episode up at this point, in my opinion, honestly has just felt pretty boring overall. Nothing that interesting or entertaining has happened up at this point, and a lot of the stuff honestly just feels really disconnected overall. And like I said, it feels like things are just kind of happening during this episode with only one significant thing that's actually happened so far when it comes to the episode. So after this, we then cut back to Fred finally, who's once again trying to interview people on the streets, and while this is happening, there's two things of note that I want to bring up. For one, we get the debut of Jake, a kid who would go on to have a pretty big role in the very next episode of the season Powerless, with him playing a big role when it comes to Kai's Powerless arc, and when it comes to Jake, he's basically the only character in this episode who has any real faith in the ninja. Outside of him, Gale's really the only one who shows any other faith in the ninja, and that's it. Because for some reason, everyone else in this episode has basically no faith in the ninja that they'll show up and help out. Which to me, honestly feels really weird. Like, I get that the ninja have been lazy for 6 months, and they haven't been that great when it comes to protecting Ninjago as a result of that. But the Lazy Ninja storyline concluded in the previous episode, Ninja vs. Lava. And during that episode, the ninja realized that they needed to get their acts together in order to take down Asphira. So the show continuing on with the idea that the ninja haven't really been doing a great job at protecting Ninjago in the next episode, after the episode where the Lazy Ninja storyline concluded, to me, that honestly feels kinda strange, and it's something that honestly I wasn't really a big fan of. But the other notable thing when it comes to this episode is this episode giving us what is, in my opinion, quite possibly the most random scene in all of Ninjago, which I genuinely think is saying something considering just how weird this franchise can get. And that is a scene where Fred ends up interviewing one of the Pyro Vipers, and the Pyro Viper actually gives him a response.
We have come to cause suffering and pain, and to end your civilization with the flames of torment.
Let me repeat that. A lava snake that fell from the sky like a meteor who ended up turning into a sentient fire snake was asked a question on live TV and actually responded. This is literally the only time this happens in the entirety of Season 11. None of the other Pyro Vipers talk, and this is something that comes completely out of nowhere, because the show never did anything to hint at the idea that the Pyro Vipers had the ability to speak. And I'm gonna be honest here, this scene feels so random and it comes completely out of left field to the point where I actually think it's kind of funny just because of how completely random this whole thing is. It's not hilarious or anything, and again, it still doesn't make a lot of sense, but it's so weird and random to the point where, again, I do actually think it is kind of funny overall. So anyway, we then cut back to Gale and Vinny, who have been following the Pyro Viper, who eventually leads them to Asphira, and the two of them listen into what Asphira has to say, where we get a chance to learn about what Asphira wants and what her overall plan is, and in the process, we get yet another problem that I have with the episode, and that is this episode being the debut of the Scroll of Forbidden Spinjitzu. The main artifact that the ninja and Asphira would be trying to get during the events of Season 11 is introduced pretty casually in an episode that isn't really that important to the season overall. It's something that's just casually brought up when one of the Pyro Vipers shows Asphira a sign about the Ninjago Museum where the Scroll of Forbidden Spinjitzu is being displayed, and that's it. It's done so casually, and this is really the only time the Scroll of Forbidden Spinjitzu is ever talked about in the episode, which in my opinion ends up making the reveal of it honestly feel kind of underwhelming considering how big of a deal the Scrolls of Forbidden Spinjitzu end up being during the season. Personally, I think it would have made a bit more sense if the Scroll of Forbidden Spinjitzu was introduced in the next episode, Powerless, because that's the episode where we actually get a chance to see the Scroll of Forbidden Spinjitzu in action for the first time, or even if the scroll was revealed in an earlier episode, I think that would have made sense, or at the very least, if this episode made a bigger deal out of the Scroll of Forbidden Spinjitzu, considering, again, it's the central artifact for the season, and again, an episode for the season that overall isn't that important. To me, it just makes the actual reveal of the scroll honestly feel kind of underwhelming in my opinion. So anyway, we then cut back to the NGTV news station where two people are debating on whether or not the Pyro Viper attack is a good or bad thing for Ninjago, and of course both sides agree that this is a bad thing. We then cut back to Fred finally, where he and his cameraman end up getting attacked by a couple of Pyro Vipers, but then the ninja show up, and I'm gonna be honest, the inclusion of the ninja in this episode honestly felt kind of forced in my opinion. They just show up towards the end of the episode, fight against a couple of Pyro Vipers, and then disappear almost as soon as they show up, with them going to Ninjago's museum. Again, the ninja just appear during this episode towards the end and disappear almost as soon as they show up. They're just kind of there basically during the episode, which, just like the reveal of the Scroll of Forbidden Spinjitzu, in my opinion, honestly feels kind of underwhelming. Personally, I think it would have been pretty interesting if we saw the ninja all throughout the episode, with them fighting against the Pyro Vipers and helping out the civilians. Personally, I think that honestly would have been something pretty cool to see, because again, their inclusion in this episode honestly feels kind of forced overall, because the ninja are just there basically during the episode, which is something that I wasn't really a big fan of. And then we cut back to Asphyra, who ends up giving a big speech in Ninjago City, with her talking to the Deceiver, who we later find out is Wu, with Asphyra saying how she wants to get revenge and how Ninjago City is going to burn unless the Deceiver reveals themselves. But the report ends up getting cut off as we cut back to the NGTV news station one last time, and that's where the episode comes to an end. And so that's pretty much all I got for you guys, and overall, yeah, I don't think this episode is pretty good. There are a couple things about this episode that I enjoyed, like the creative concept for the episode, and I think a couple of the jokes work, but by and large, I just don't think this episode is all that good. Like I said, it feels like there isn't really that much of a plot to this episode outside the stuff with Gale and Vinny, but even then, the episode doesn't really focus on these two all that much, and for the most part, it feels like stuff just happens during the episode. A lot of the jokes, I feel, don't really work that well, which results in the episode feeling pretty boring in my opinion. I'm not really the biggest fan of how the ninja were handled during the episode, because they basically just show up towards the end of the episode, don't really get that much to do, and then they disappear almost as soon as they show up. The reveal of the Scroll of Forbidden Spinjitzu honestly feels really underwhelming considering it's done in such a casual way. And again, this episode isn't really that important to Season 11 overall, which only makes the reveal feel even more underwhelming in my opinion. And overall, I just don't think this episode is really all that interesting or even all that entertaining. It's an episode that, in my opinion, is honestly just pretty bad overall with very few good things about it. And in my opinion, this is the worst episode of Season 11. I really do not like this episode overall. And in my opinion, not only is this the worst episode of Season 11, but in my opinion, this is definitely one of the worst episodes that we ended up getting when it came to the Wild Reign era of the franchise. And this episode really wasn't that good overall. And so that's pretty much all I got for you guys. So tell me down below what do you guys think. Tell me what are your guys' thoughts when it comes to this episode. Again, tell me down below, and I hope you guys enjoy. Later, guys. This is Dimension Master Studios, signing off.